video, we're going to walk through how to integrate search and specifically to search using a date range. If you have your application open, you know that we have our invoice table, but say if we had 1,000 invoices or 1,000,000 invoices, it'd be pretty difficult to just look at them line by line. You really need to be able to search and be able to search using a date range. In another episode, I'll show you how to integrate a regular search feature where it searches the content. But for this one, we're actually going to search using a date filter. And so to get started, let's first create a branch. So we're going to do get checkout -b and say adding search. So we're on our new branch, and now we'll go up to app, and then we will go into views, and from views let's go to invoices and index. And so the very first thing we're going to do is just add in a couple search bars. So I'm going to create a new row up at the top and do div class equals row, and then let's move this over, just indent it a little bit, and now we're going to do another div, and so we're going to do a div inside a div, and we'll do div class equals pull dash right, and then I'm going to put in here something called range query. This doesn't mean anything yet. What it is it's a class that we're going to add to our CSS file here in a little bit, but you don't have to worry about it at the moment, but just put it inside. And the way that we're going to integrate the search fields is we're actually going to embed some Ruby. If you remember, the file ends in .erb, which stands for embedded Ruby, and that's exactly what we're going to do right here. So we're going to start with brackets, and then do the % and then equals. It's very important you put the equals. If you don't put the equals, Ruby will still be called. However, whatever you call will not be displayed on the page. The equals will make it be displayed. And then we're going to say form underscore tag, which is going to create a form for us. And then we want to do invoices underscore path. That's related to our routes. So if you do rake routes, you can see that we have something called invoices path, which all this is going to do is make sure the form sends us exactly right back to this page. So the users aren't going to see anything with this. It's just going to happen on the server side. So we'll do invoices path, and then do a comma, and say method :space :get. And what that's doing is it's saying that this is going to use a get protocol, which means it's going to store the items and show them up in the URL bar instead of doing a post request, which is another way of sending it where it's not shown in the URL bar. But I like doing it when you're doing search and different things where the user may actually want to keep that search and save it and come back to it later. So I'm going to do that, and then do, which is going to start our block, and we'll end this line. So you say %, then the greater than symbol. Come down the next line, indent it, and then we're going to embed some more Ruby. So do that same starting sequence, and then type in text underscore field underscore tag, and then we're going to say search, and then start with brackets and do date from in the brackets and that string, comma, search, and you do the @ symbol, which means we're using an instance variable. So @ symbol, date from, and we've not told Ruby what that means yet, so if we tried to use this right now, this wouldn't work. We're going to have to add that inside our controller. So then we're going to do the other field. So we're going to do the same setup and say text field, tag, search, and now we're going to do date to. So all this is doing is These are collecting the parameters we're going to give it, and it's going to start from the beginning of the query until the end. And then we'll say search dot date to end this line. And then we have to give it a submit button so that it has a way of actually starting this request. And so to do that, you just do submit underscore tag, give it a string, and we'll say search. And always make sure that you have the same number. So if you use a regular apostrophe, close it off with an apostrophe. If you use double quotes, then close off with double quotes. And we'll do class, and we want this button to look nice, so we'll do class btn, and we'll say search button. And just like we did before, and we'll indent this, just like we did before, search button, this is a class kind of like range query that we've not created yet, so this has no effect at the moment, but it will in a little bit here. And so now we want to close this off, and so if you notice, when I'm embedding this Ruby, I'm not putting an equal sign in front of this because we don't want this to show up. So put that in. Now go back a few spots, close off the first div, and then we're going to close off the second div. And there you go. This should be all we need to do on the index page, and don't go to it right now or start the server right now because we haven't implemented a lot of this. We're just kind of filling it in, and we're going to implement that here shortly. So the next step is to actually create a model that is going to create this functionality for us. And so it's a best practice in Ruby to create models whenever we're wanting to segment the functionality and the features so that we know exactly where that feature has been built. So if we have to extend it at all, or if there are any bugs in it, we know exactly what file to go to. And so the way you do that is come over to app, then go down to models, and right now you can see we have our invoice model, which is blank, and we're not going to touch that. Just right click on models and say new file, and right here we're going to say invoice underscore search dot rb. And so this will create a new file for us. We can open it up, and you can see that it's blank. And so this is what we're going to add to. So the very first thing we have to do is name it. So say class and invoice search, and it's very important that you keep your names correct, because if you try to have a different one than the file name, or even if you made this S lowercase, then you're going to run into some issues. So do class invoice search and use that camel case for it. And then we're going to do something called attribute reader, and it's actually, the way you say it is different than the way you type it out. So you just do attr underscore reader, and all this is going to do is it's setting up some variables or some symbols that we're going to be using. And the first one we've already talked about is date from, and the next one is date to. So that's just going to give us some setters and getters so that we can use these variables. Next thing is we have to create a function to initialize it, and so there's a number of different programming languages out there, and some, if you've been dealing with object-oriented languages before, like PHP, you may have heard of something called like a constructor. This is the same type of function, except we're just calling it initialize. So you type in def initialize, and we're going to pass it some parameters. We're just going to call them params, and then our params, this is an important sequence right here, because we're going to be essentially connecting this into the parameters into a hash. And so the way to do that is you do two pipes, And the way you get to the pipe, if you haven't used it before, is you hit Shift, and then the key right above return on your keyboard is where it should be. And you give it 2 of those, and they're usually called pipes, and then an equals button, and then curly brackets. And so all that's going to do is saying that we're going to be placing these items into the params and be adding to them. The next thing we're going to do is set up a instance variable, or 2 instance variables actually. We talked about it in our on our last file in this index.html file. Right here, if you notice, we have this date from and this date to. This is going to be taking in these parameters, and this is what we're going to be using so we know what we're searching, what parameters we're searching with. So for date from, you're going to set that equal to parse date. And one important thing, parse date is a function we haven't built yet, so we'll build that here in a second. Parse date, and we're going to say params, which is just params is what we're passing the constructor or the initializer up here, and so we're just saying let's grab those params, and let's first grab the date from param, and then close that off in the brackets. And then we're going to do a built-in Ruby function so that we're going to by default always show all the invoices that are in the last 7 days. So I think that's a good way of with building out an invoicing type application. We want to do 7 days dot ago dot to underscore date dot to underscore s. Now that may look extremely weird to you, especially if you haven't done a lot of Ruby development. All that's saying is we're going to take in this date, we're going to take that date 7 days in the past, and then we're going to turn it back into a string after we've turned it into a date. If you don't understand why, don't worry, it's actually a little bit complex. It's just making it possible for us to take in a date parameter and then use it. So this is just setting up our defaults. This isn't actually, don't worry, it's not always going to show the 7 days. It's just showing that by default when you load up the page. And so I'll show you how we're going to customize it here in a second. So I copied this because our date to is actually very similar. So just change it from, instead of date from, to date to. We're still going to use this method that we're about to create, and then params, change this to date to, and then with this one we're just going to say capital D for date dot today dot to s, and this one's a little easier to understand than the one above it. Date takes in the built-in date class for Ruby, and then today it automatically calls whatever the date is today, and then it turns it into a string so it can actually be used and displayed. And so that's it for our initializer. And then we're going to go down here, and we need to do something what's called a scope. And what a scope is it's going to tell us exactly where the ranges are going to be. So when we do our search, the scope is going to search between date A and date B. And so it's actually a very easy method to implement. All it is one line, and we're going to type in invoice because that's our main model. So when we do this, we're going to actually be searching through and running a query through the database. So we're going to look on the invoice table, and then we're going to look for where. And let's look up our schema file really quick to make sure that I did call this date, because sometimes I do have different names for them. Let's see, go to DB, and let's go to Schema, RB, and yes, I did call it date. This is something that you may want to get used to doing, is going to your Schema file. Never make any changes to this, because if you make any changes, then it's going to screw some things up. This is only so you can go take a quick look, check what your names are, check some data types and things like that. So that is date. So what the query is going to look like, it's going to be date, and then in all caps I'll do between, we'll do a question mark and another question mark. And I'll walk through how this works here in a second. And then we do date from and date to. And then we end it out. So all this is doing, it looks up the invoice database. It searches for all the records that are between date from and date to. And this is a little bit of SQL code combined with active record, which is what Ruby and on Rails uses to access the database. And the reason why I'm doing this, it's like a prepared statement, and this helps from a security standpoint. So there's actually a filter that gets utilized when you use this format, and so it protects against people trying to put malicious code into your site. So this is our scope. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a private method. You remember when I talked about parse date up here? That's what we're going to create. And we're going to make it a private method. So any methods below this are going to be private. And all that means is that if I make something private, nothing else except this file can access it. So I don't want some other model or some other controller being able to call parse date for the invoice search function. This is something I want exclusive here. So I'm going to do def parsed date, and then we're going to pass it two arguments. We're going to say date string and then a default. Now all this means is we're going to be passing a string because that's what we're getting from the search box, and so that data type of string we're passing right in here. And so in the defaults, just if that doesn't work. So I'm going to do date, and make sure you do capital D, and then parse, which is a built-in Ruby function, and then pass it date string. So that's just going to turn it in, take a string and then turn it into a date format. And then I'm going to say if this did not work, instead of showing some ugly error message, I'm going to rescue it with a more specific error message. And so we'll say argument error, make sure you do the capitalization for A and the E there, and then type error. And so all that's going to do is help us out to know what the problem is. If somebody, say they, instead of typing the type of date in or something like that, they type in a sentence. We don't want that working, obviously, so this will help protect against that. So we end off that private method, and then we end off the class completely. So that is our invoice search feature right there. And the last thing that we have to do to actually make this work is to now edit the controller. And surprisingly, the controller is actually the easiest part of this, so which makes it nice. So come up to controllers and then go to invoices controller, and then we're going to come to this index action, and this, we're going to get rid of all of this right here. And I'm going to create a instance variable called search and set it equal to invoice search dot new, and then pass it params bracket search, and then we want to take our invoices, set that equal to search dot scope. Okay, and all this is doing is it's accessing our invoice search model, this class that we made that has that functionality right up here. So it's accessing that. It's going to create a new instance of that, and it's going to pass in the search parameters. So when we pass in the params right here, that's where it's giving the date from and the date to, and then it's going to automatically plug that into invoices because we're taking this instance variable search and plugging it in. You notice we're also calling scope on search. So you remember when we created this scope method, we're actually calling it right in here. And we can call this because we created this new instance of this class. So if you don't know a lot about object-oriented design or programming, then don't worry, just do this. And the more that you build out these type of applications, you'll actually get very used to it, and it'll start making sense to you. And I may actually create some videos explaining how that works, especially from a Ruby perspective. But for right now, just plug it in like that and know that we're calling this model and we're plugging it in with our parameters. So this was a lot of work for a single feature like this. So we haven't tested it out yet. So let's see if this is going to work. So I'll do Rails S. And by default, I have to look at our test data. When we bring this up, if you remember, our default is going to be 7 days ago to today. So I'm thinking this may not even show us any data. So when we come up here and click on invoices, you see how it doesn't have anything, but by default, this all worked. So by default, it brought in 322 to 329, so it brought in everything from last week. So let's do from the beginning of the year. So we'll do 122 to 329. Hit search, and there you go. So this all works. First time too, which is actually pretty, I'm pretty happy with that, because this type, when you put in that much functionality from scratch, a lot of times you'll run into a number of bugs. So this all worked nicely. You can put in any kind of date range. So you see we have the 8th and the 9th here. So say that we only wanted to go up to 308, hit search, and you can see that it took care of the query, and it only listed it out with the one item. Now if you want to see how this actually works from a SQL perspective, you can come back here to Nitrous, and you can see, look down here in the console, and you see where it says invoice load? This is the query. So when we created this scope up here and gave it these items for the search, it actually translated this into traditional SQL code when the application got run. So it said select invoices, which is invoice table, and it says from invoice where the date is between this date and this date, which are the dates we passed in. So this all works beautifully. In the next episode, what we're going to do, you may notice that these search boxes and the search button aren't really aligned perfectly. I would like to bring them up so they're in line with this listing invoices. And so the way we're going to do that is actually coming back to this index page is just by putting in some CSS into the application. And so we're going to line everything up just manually that way. So that's what we're going to do in our next video. So I'll see you then.